So hello, everyone, and welcome to the June National Association of District Export Councils webinar. And today's webinar is entitled Export Compliance, Best Practices for 2023. And we will introduce our presenter, Jennifer Diaz, and we thank her very much for her willingness to share her knowledge and experience. But before we do, I wanted to just mention that my name is Tom Dustman. I am the Midwest representative from the Missouri deck on to the National Association of District Export Councils. And I co-chair the Education and Outreach Committee of NADAC with Shariah Johnson, and she's on the screen as well. So we make a really good team, and we've had a number of really excellent webinars. And behind the curtain is Heidi Whitman, who does all of the real coordination and the efforts to ensure we always have a successful webinar. So Heidi, thank you. And Shariah, thank you as well for being the co-chair of this committee. And I would also like to introduce Felicia Correa. Felicia is a member of the Puerto Rico deck. She is also a member of the NADAC Education and Outreach Committee. And it's my privilege to turn the introduction over to Felicia, and she will introduce today's presenter, Jennifer Diaz. So Felicia, please go ahead. Oh, you're muted, Felicia.
All right.
There you are.
Now
Okay.
you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. For me, it is a pleasure to be here and share some key challenges for compliance to be presented by Jennifer Diaz, attorney. I consider that this conference is timely and relevant. Export compliance is especially important considering the international and global evolutions. The laws, regulations, and technology development are to be considered when you are exporting products or services to other countries. This afternoon promised to be invigorating and informative. I look forward to hearing from you how this theme is of benefit for you and your company. I hope that you enjoy it, and now I leave you with Jennifer Diaz.
Thank you so much, Felicia, and thank you, Tom, Shariah, and Heidi. There's so much work that goes on behind the scenes to get any event going, so a huge thank you to everyone at NADAC for making this work. I'm a proud member of our South Florida District Export Council and been involved in the deck for some time. So for those of you that are not involved in your local decks, highly, highly encourage that as well. There's so much that it takes to get things done within your local decks and local communities, and it takes volunteers that care and that love export compliance to get everything done. So I am a board certified international attorney, and I've been doing this for too long. It's almost 20 years, which some people say is nothing. So I guess I'm still at the beginning of my career. Apparently I have a ways to go until retirement, Tom just told me. So it'll be some time before I am, I guess, free, let's say, to travel the world. But until then, I've been dealing with import and export compliance, and I love both sides of the mix. And there's so much to learn on a daily basis. I say that if you're in import or export compliance or in this world, you have to love the crazy, and you have to be able to keep in touch with what's going on a daily basis. We have 47 government agencies that regulate imports and exports, and we get to deal with all of them. So I deal with anything from US Customs to OFAC to BIS to DDTC to TSA to FDA to FMC to the TTB, and the list goes on and on and on. So our specialty at Diaz Trade Law is complying with the crazy fun regulations, hopefully what we call pre-compliance, in advance of a transaction. But as you can imagine, how many people want to pay lawyers before something goes wrong? And the answer is unfortunately not as many as I would love it to be. So if I could change the world and change the way people import or export, I would be a lot meaner and I'd require tests in advance of importing or exporting. And I think that's just because I'm bitter and had to take so many tests to become a lawyer and to become board certified. So I think everybody should have to take some tests. But in reality, it's quite easy to buy something online and to not think about the consequences or to make a purchase. So today, we have a whole lot that we're going to talk about in regards to some export compliance best practices. We will have the Q&A box as we go today, so I want you to feel free to use the Q&A box to ask all sorts of questions. We got one in regards to the PowerPoint. PowerPoint will definitely be available. I'll be sending it to Heidi as soon as we're done in a PDF format, and she'll be sharing that with everyone. I know we are recording the webinar. Heidi will let us know at the end if the recording itself will be available. I know that that was a question that came through. And there's a whole lot to talk about. The first thing is, what's an attorney without a disclaimer, right? Always a disclaimer. Every situation's different. So I want you to know we're going to talk about generic export controls advice, but your particular situation, whatever that may be, I urge you to have your own import-export counsel that you communicate with, that's your own expert, to talk about your specific situation. I am happy to take any questions as they come along and happy to answer any offline. You want to ask about your friend's situation, which is perfectly fine as well. It doesn't have to be yours. It could be anybody's situation or generic question as well. We will have one poll when we start out, and I'll go through that in a second. But before that, in terms of everything we're going to cover today, I think we've got a lot of ground to cover. One is in regards to an export compliance plan. I'm going to hopefully make the case for it for you so that you have some homework to do, because what fun is it to not go back to school and have some homework? Want everyone to leave here with a good idea of what should be in your toolkit to come up with a great export compliance plan that should pass muster and also be useful, because we see a lot of export compliance plans that are put in a drawer, thrown away, and they come back, when somebody asks for it. But we'll talk about what should be in your export compliance plan and training on it. We'll also talk about some examples of what not to do. There's a lot of those, and we've only picked a couple for you today, but there's so many of them, and I'll show you where to pick from, because those are great trainings to have. And I always say people will come for food, so bring some food and bring some pizza and bring a copy of Don't Let This Happen to You and watch Let the Good Times Roll. You'll see a lot of fun there. We'll talk about everything that should be your elements to be in your import-export compliance plan, your risks that should be assessed as well. Every business has different risks, whatever yours are, what you need to know, and maintaining it and updating it and getting your employees trained on it, and then what to do if everything hits the fan, because those are all things that everyone worries about. So all of those things are things we'll be talking about today. And again, I'm happy to take questions as they come along in the Q&A as well. So you'll see that. And I know, perfect, good. And I know Tom and Heidi have written in the chat box as well, so you guys can see that too. Perfect. All right, so Heidi's going to put out our poll, because I'm curious for all of you. I'm so pleased you're all taking an hour to be here with us today. I want to know who we're talking to. So are you a exporter, forwarder, regulatory affairs professional? Are you in-house legal? Are you sales? Are you just interested in exporting? Could be any of the above, but it's interesting to kind of get a mix in terms of where everybody comes from. And everybody's products are going to be different. Everybody's everything are going to be different, but it's nice to get a glimpse of who you are. So are you an exporter, forwarder, in regulatory affairs, in legal, in sales, or just think exporting's cool and want to hear more? All right, we got a big mix, which is always a good thing to have. So thank you all for taking the time to put in your results. I appreciate that. It's helpful. All right. So first, why should you have an export compliance plan in place? A biggie is it demonstrates to the government that you have it together. And it's a biggie because if the government comes a knocking, they want to know what your processes are. And if you don't have it in writing, does it really exist? If it's in somebody's head, it doesn't count. If it's a process that you've had forever, what happens when that person that didn't put it in writing goes on vacation, leaves, quits, didn't train the next person? Doesn't work. Has to be in writing for it to count. And then has to be something you're actually doing. You can't just make it up all the way. It's got to be a process that you actually follow. And it demonstrates to the government that you actually care about compliance. And it also gets your employees on the same point. Because what if everybody has a different vision of what really their tasks are and what should be done? It's hard to put processes and practices in writing and in place and getting everybody trained and up to date and up to speed on them and everyone on the same page. But it makes a huge difference, because one of the first things that the government wants to see if there's an issue is, cool, so what are your processes? What are your procedures? What went wrong? What happened? What are you changing? What's going to be different next time? Is everyone human? Absolutely. Do mistakes occur? Absolutely. That's going to be a given. The question is what you do about them. And when it comes to export compliance, more so than import compliance, what's so scary is the criminal liability. And if this doesn't keep you up at night, if you are the owner of your company, it should, because the criminal potential, I don't know about you, but prison is scary. It should be scary for everybody. And that alone should be an incentive to have an export compliance plan in place to make sure that your employees are trained. Because if any of you, a lot of you are exporters or forwarders. We've seen forwarders go to jail. We've seen exporters go to jail. Nobody wants to see these things. It's not a good thing for anybody. But look at these penalty amounts too. They're not nothing. They are substantial. When we're talking about $1 million and a violation, potentially 20 years in prison when it comes to BIS violations, that's just the criminal side. The civil side, 300 plus or twice the value of the transaction, whichever is greater. These are meant to sting. They're meant to hurt, and they're inflation adjusted. So that's another fun fact that not a lot of people realize is the Federal Register notice comes out, and then you get a penalties have been inflation adjusted, because they can't stay stagnant. If inflation goes up, then these penalty amounts, they go up too. Smart question. So somebody asked, well, is there a standard format for an export compliance program? Where do I start? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what should be in an export compliance program. Export.gov is pretty amazing, I do have to say. It's a little overwhelming, but it's amazing all at the same time. So when you go on export.gov, you're going to see a lot of trainings as well as some samples. Granted, you're going to have to put together a lot of the juice yourself. I'm going to talk about what should be in it, and then you're going to have to do some work here. I wish that there was a template per se that worked as a one size fits all for everyone, but there's no such thing that's a God for everyone. But there are generic guidances of what should be included. And last time I looked, export.gov at least had a sample-ish of things that they want to see in it. We're going to talk about that a little bit today as well. So if by the end of today you have no idea where to start, then talk to me, because you should at least have a good idea of what that secret sauce should look like and at least what should be included within. And honestly, the penalties and liabilities should also be included within. This should be a reason to wake your employees up as well, because any employee that has a responsibility for export compliance, this is scary. And everybody should know that this is why we have to get it right, because nobody wants to see any of these penalties. Do the penalties come out of your employee's paycheck when they get it wrong? No, it doesn't work that way. It's a company liability, but there may be some employee consequences. People may get fired as a result of it. They may have whatever consequence for their employment as well. And God forbid anybody goes to jail, which nobody wants to see. Prison is not a benefit here. So this should be at the beginning along with the management commitment. Why do you, as the owner, if you are the owner, why do you take export compliance seriously? And what does it mean? Why is it essential to your particular company? So we'll talk about your management commitment letter that I urge everybody to start their export compliance plan with. So let's talk a little bit about people that got it wrong. I mean, anybody heard about this small little company named Microsoft? Who would think that they could do anything wrong, right? But here's the fun part, right? US companies are held accountable for the activities of their foreign subsidiaries. Fun, right? When you think about US jurisdiction, if you're a US entity and you have a foreign subsidiary, you've got to make sure that they comply with US rules also. Who thinks about this? You have to think about this. So OFAC and BIS, they list all of their penalties. And this isn't just the BISs don't let this happen to you. OFAC and BIS can combine forces. And in this instance, for example, Microsoft's subsidiary, Microsoft Russ LLC, they caused another subsidiary to enter or sell a software licensing agreement that violated the EAR. Bottom line is they sold to two guys on the bad guy list. So what do we have to learn from this? Here's the fun part, right? It was only 3.3. And I say only 3.3 because they disclosed the alleged violation to BIS and to OFAC, meaning they told BIS and OFAC, hey, I screwed up. I'm so sorry. Here's what happened. Now imagine if they didn't tell BIS and OFAC what this number would be. To give you a glimpse, here's some recent penalties. And look, Wells Fargo, $30 million. A lot. There's a lot of money here all over the place. So these penalties can be really, really, really steep. And BIS issued an order and OFAC issued a settlement agreement, and you have to negotiate with these entities separately. And it's completely and utterly public. There's no private negotiation of these. So your name is blasted everywhere. So what can you do differently? What should they have done? Think about it. In terms of sales, these are potentially online sales, potentially orders from people. What did they do to check who the end user was here? So when we think about end users, how are you blocking specific countries that are sanctioned? How do you check? How do you validate? What are you doing in your particular company to ensure the wrong person doesn't get a hold of your item, regardless of what that item is? Here it's software. So imagine this could be virtually uploaded in some fancy cloud, and all of a sudden the wrong person is downloading your particular software, and you, US entity owned by US person, is in trouble because a subsidiary of yours sold the software to a bad guy and they didn't do their homework. But what kind of oversight did you have? So what we've seen the government not take lightly is, okay, before you purchase a new subsidiary, what due diligence are you doing? Because something that we recommend, for example, is Tom's got a really sexy company. So I'm going to do some due diligence of his company. And before I buy it, I'm going to make Tom do the disclosure. Tom's going to disclose all of his bad thingamajigs, and then I will purchase him after he's disclosed. So any potential penalty is pre-disclosure. It's something to consider as well as you think about merging. And there's a lot of M&A transactions that we're seeing with amazing venture capital firms buying up all sorts of amazing stuff. So when you think about due diligence before then, think about what sins you're disclosing and at what point you're disclosing them, because the government has made very, very clear that routine and consistent disclosures is not equivalent to compliance. And what that means is if I want to keep purchasing up Tom's company, then Shariah's company, then Felicia's company, then Heidi's company, and after I purchase them, then I keep disclosing and we keep making mistakes, and it's a routine pattern, then I'm not effectively doing my due diligence as I'm buying companies. I'm buying problems, not doing my homework, not adequately fixing those entities prior to my acquisitions. And I think that I can just keep disclosing it to the government and get away with it. The government has said repeat disclosures does not equal compliance, and you're going to see penalties. So the first time you disclose, you may get very, very lucky with a slap on the wrist. So we'll talk more about disclosures as well. All right. Good. So, good. So someone put in the chat box in the Q&A, and I'll publish that for everyone as well, a great export management and compliance tool from the BIS, which is a great one for everyone to have. So everybody will have a great resource as well from BIS. Thank you for that. All right. Another horror story to talk about. $300 million Seagate was fined for violations of export controls. Why? Because they sent hard disk drives, HDDs, to Huawei. And they ordered or caused the export of over 7.4 million hard disk drives subject to the foreign direct product rule without BIS authorization. Now, what's interesting is as part of these agreements, sometimes what's included is an audit requirement or a 5-year suspended denial order. Sometimes you have to stop exporting, period, as a result of an order. Sometimes you have to hire specific counsel. Sometimes it depends on what the order is, but think about $300 million. What would that do to your company today if you had a $300 million fine? Would you still be in existence? It's a lot. So what's interesting here is the value of the 7.4 hard disk drives was 1.1 million. So in this instance, what did they do? BIS did 300 million is more than twice of what the profits, the net profits for the illegal exports were. And that's what they decided would hurt bad enough. That's pretty brutal. And in this instance, the harder portion is there was a specific rule saying you can't sell to Huawei, and they did it anyway. So it's like direct defiance. And now if you're going to do it anyways, when there's a specific rule that says it's a no-no, this is the penalty for that. So now double your net profits being your penalty. Is it worth it still? So what do we learn from this? I mean, sometimes people aren't keeping up with the ever-changing landscape. Sometimes people are purposefully avoiding or going around the rules. So wherever anyone is specifically messing up, what would your compliance plan do differently? And something else that we like to look at is internally, what do you do if you see something that looks a little shady? Is there somebody who could have internally stopped a transaction before it happened? And who would they tell? So in your export compliance plan, what I want you to think of is some companies have anonymous reporting. Do you have a 1-800 number? Do you have a way in which somebody can leave a note or can call a number or can leave an untraceable email somehow? Is there a way that somebody can get a message across anonymously to talk about, maybe it's your boss? Do you want to talk about your boss? Probably not. It may be uncomfortable, but who can you tell if you know something shady is going on within your company? And if it is your company, who do you want that person to be? Where do you want those phone calls to go? Who do you want to be notified? And if something is happening, how does that message get across so that you can potentially stop it? So if you do have employees, especially when you're training them, how do you want to train them to do the right thing? So within your compliance plan, these are all of the titles of things that I want you to think about within it. So one, management commitment. We talked about that a little bit. So I do want that letter from the owner of your entity or your board. Or it's got to be somebody who can sign on behalf of the company should be writing this letter. If you can't sign on behalf of the company, then this letter shouldn't come from you. And it should discuss why export compliance is important to you. The next portion should definitely, you've got to go through a risk assessment yourself. Do you sell online? Do you have potential risk for people from sanctioned countries to purchase your product? What are you doing to block them? Do you have a lot of agents that sell your product around the world? What are the potential risks that you particularly face? Do you sell medical devices all over the world and maybe you're dealing with some sanctioned countries and general licenses? What are your risks? Could somebody on a bad guy list get your particular product? Anybody, that can happen to all of us, right? What are the specific risks that your product has in place? How are you figuring out for export authorization how your product is classified and who does and doesn't need a license, when you do, when you don't need a license? What department within your firm is figuring that out? How do you decide that internally? And if it's questionable, who do you go to? So we're going to talk about the chart of what you should be utilizing and a general guidance from BIS that we have. That's a great tool. And then I want you to create your own kind of flow on how you classify your goods and how you make a license determination on whether or not your goods need or don't need a license, and how you keep records that you did that particular homework. And speaking of records, keeping your records, because if BIS comes a knocking, not having records alone is a potential issue, and that we don't want to be you. We'll talk about auditing and internal monitoring. I like to utilize ACE. So for those of you that don't yet have an ACE account, or if you do and it's only for the import side, you better turn on imports and exports. You turn on both. I'll teach you some of the reports that I like and some of the items that I like within the report to look at, so you guys can come up with your own internal monitoring and auditing system. And then if stuff goes wrong, because unfortunately, I've never met a perfect company. None of us are perfect individuals. Nobody is perfect on any given day. Everyone does make a mistake at some point in time. So if that happens, what do you do? So let's keep it going. So when it comes to OFAC compliance commitments, what does OFAC want to see? You're going to see similar, right? Management commitment, risk assessment. What are your internal controls? What are your processes? How do you test and audit that? And how do you train your employees? Training should be a big element no matter what, because every program has to have an implementation. Because if you create the sexy program and nobody in your company knows about it and nobody's trained on it, and nobody utilizes it, what happens next? How does that all work? I like also to check out and to make sure in the beginning of my export compliance plans that we talk about what export controls generally are, what federal agencies are involved, what are the active ongoing sanction programs that exist right now. Like a little bit about FCPA, depending upon where your particular company is and where you're doing business, and a little bit about anti-boycott provisions. This is a section that I like to have in my export compliance plan so that it's clear to everyone within the company that there are a lot of agencies involved. It's not just one. You've got a lot of federal agencies and everybody has a different role to play. So we're going to be dealing with OFAC for sanctions, but maybe BIS for licenses, or maybe DDTC for licenses. So every entity has a different role and different regulations that they implement and enforce. So when we talk about those agencies, I like to talk about EAR, or the Export Administration Regulations, as in the overview, oversight by the Department of Commerce, BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security. We deal with a lot of acronyms in this crazy fun space. So we didn't get to ask how many of you are pros and how many of you are beginners. But as you go through, you've got to go through about 850 acronyms to get to pro status here. So when you can tell me BIS, OFAC, DDTC, Census, and so on, and EAR and ITAR, and when you can name all of these things with your eyes closed, then you know you're in a really good place, because it's a lot. So when you start thinking about export controls, I want you to think of a conversation as an export, which is crazy to think of. But are you talking to a foreign national? Because if somebody is a foreign national physically in the United States, you speaking to them, you could potentially need a license for that. It's kind of nuts. And people don't necessarily think that way. We used to talk about a fax or an email, and all of those things are true, but it could even be a conversation. So if you're talking about something, you have to think about who you're saying it to and what you're discussing. The export administration regulations, typically, I would say 90+% of exports are governed by the EAR. It's a lot. It's the majority. And this could be anything from software to computers to pencils to you name it. Now, some things may be what we call EAR 99. We'll talk about that a little bit more, where you don't necessarily need a license from the BIS, but that doesn't mean that you're done with your evaluation and done with your homework. There's a protocol to go through. When it comes to ITAR, I was always taught, and it was really memorable, so I hope it's memorable for you. Think about anything that goes boom or bang. Think about items that can be used for militaries. And that's when we typically think of international traffic in arms regulations, ITAR. And for that, we absolutely need licenses from the Department of State Defense Directorate for Trade Controls. We call them DDTC, or state. Now, when it comes to the foreign trade regulations, I think of census. And when you think of census, you think of statistics. They want to know everything. Very, very nosy. Everything coming into the country and everything leaving the country. And it's amazing because the data that you can get from census is, I think, extra sexy. When it comes to data, you can see everything coming into the country, from what country, and it's based upon awesome Schedule Bs on the export side, HTSs on the import side. We can do country of origin, and all that amazing ACE data that we get goes to census for the most part. So then we get to see who's trading with who, what are we buying, what are we selling, who are we doing business with? And that data itself is phenomenal. So when census doesn't get the data or you mess up the data, census is not very happy about that. So when you think about census, I want you to think about your EEI filings. And that happens whenever you're exporting more than $2,500 worth of one Schedule B. So you think of one Schedule B, basically your classification of goods, and whenever you're exporting, you need to file your EEI. So where I see a lot of rife when it comes to EEI, it's a who's responsible for filing. So there's a lot of finger pointing at that time. My forwarder should have filed that. No, you should have filed that. Who? Wait, who? And my question always is it in writing? With a smile, because most things in life are no. But I thought, you thought? Show me your export compliance policy. Oh, in writing? In writing. Right. Where is it in your manual? Manual? Yes. So when you think about your manual, I want you to think about your practices in the weeds, the nitty gritty. And we want to make sure that agencies like Census are happy with us. So I want you to think of who in your company or outside of your company is responsible for the accuracy of your EEI filings. It's no different on the import side. If your broker files your 7501 for import transactions, the importer of record is liable and responsible for the accuracy, despite it being a broker that filed. If a forwarder files your EEI and it's incorrect, your forwarder's not getting slapped, you as the USPPI likely are. So we want to think about these things, and we want to think about who's liable, who's responsible, who actually has that primary benefit, who has the most to gain by the export transaction. If you're selling the goods, it's you. So pushing off responsibility and liability to other parties is what we see a lot of. So we want to ensure that you think about these things as you're putting your policies and practices together. And when it comes to OFAC, the one thing I like to think about is my bank account, right? So when a lot of companies come to us, unfortunately, they're like, so I used to have $1 million more in my bank account, and now I don't have $1 million in this bank account. It went missing. Can you help me figure out what happened here? Okay. So we start from the beginning and find out that there's an underlying OFAC issue. And maybe there wasn't a license that there should have been in the first place. And we've got to dig and figure it out and maybe file a disclosure or two, maybe request a license after the fact, and maybe fight to get that money back, depending on how that goes. But we've seen all sorts of instances like that. Anything from Cuba to Venezuela violations to you name it. But when it comes to OFAC, I want you to think of money. And think about your money. Is it okay for you to receive the money that you want to receive? Because trust me, your bank is watching. Felicia is watching with close eyes every transaction. And she sees the word Cuba or Venezuela, she's freaking out. She wants to be sure that that money is lawful and legitimate and licensed, and there is no issue with that, or she could tattletale on you to OFAC. Not that Felicia's a tattletale. She's a very nice woman. But it's a banker's job to monitor those transactions as well. And they have a fiduciary responsibility to OFAC, just as you do as an exporter, to comply with the rules. So a lot of people are watching your every move. So we'll talk about more tools to put in your toolkit as you're thinking about putting your plan together. So when it comes to that management commitment, what I'd like you to think about and to ensure is included is why compliance is important to you over a sale. And that's hard because I'm a business owner. I get it. If you don't sell, you don't make money, and then what? But is it more important for your employees to get the concept that compliance is more important than making a buck? Because if making a buck is more important than compliance, then this isn't going to work for anybody. You've got to have both. You have to have compliance and making a buck. And I want everybody to make a whole lot of money. Everybody should make a whole lot of money, but with annoying rules, and rules have to be followed in this instance, and they get very, very technical and very nitty gritty, but it's the only way anybody survives here. So what else should be in there? a framework for action and escalation. So what we talked about before a little bit is, who do I call? Who do I go to? How does it work? So like if I notice, and Heidi, sorry, you'll be the bad guy right now. If I notice Heidi's doing something wrong, do I get to call Tom? Who do I call? How does it work inside of my company? What supervisor can I communicate with? Can I go directly to the owner? Is it okay? Am I bothering them? Are they going to hate me? They don't even know my name. However you want it to work within your company is perfectly fine, but you need to have a process where your employees feel confident escalating any potential red flag that they see within your supply chain. And if they don't, that's an issue for you, business owner. Within your management commitment letter, it needs to say, I care about compliance. Did you see these crazy penalties? They're not a joke. Nobody here under my watch is going to jail. That's not what I want to see for me or for my company. So we are going to care about compliance more than we are going to care about sales, and we are going to do this the right way. And if you see anybody that doesn't comply with this policy of doing things the right way, this is what you can do. Great. Now, who's my empowered official? Who is my person that can act? Because as a business owner, you don't want everything to fall on you. And if it's a company of one, it is you. It is what it is. But if you have 50 employees, 100 employees, thousands of employees, it does not all have to be you. Somebody else gets to act. Who do you give the power to make a decision on your behalf? Who has the power to say, no, we're not going to sell this? If it's not going to be you, think about who's going to be that person that you give that designation and that power to say no. And what are the consequences of non-compliance we talked about? So you want everybody to really have a good glimpse of why they should care themselves and why they should have their own commitment. Everybody, I hope if you're a pro, you've seen this before. If you're not a pro, this is an amazing tool that I mandate be in your export compliance plan. This is our decision tree from a BIS side. So are you subject to the EAR, to the Export Administration Regulations? There's a test at the end of this. And then how do you classify your item under the ECCN, your Export Control Classification number on your CCL, your Commerce Control List? I told you we're acronym heavy here, right? So now you'll see the EAR 99, which means no license would be required. Typically, you would be EAR 99 is the majority of items. Think about water, pencils, food, your generic items, not sexy stuff. Now, do you see how it's not just over? Now we have to talk about general prohibitions. Do they apply? This is where we think about, okay, I'm just selling a PlayStation. I'm just selling pencils or pens or food or punching bags or whatever the item may be. But where are you selling them to? And where are they ultimately going? And how do you know? And did you ask? Were there red flags? These are all the things that the government wants you to think about before you say, I'm good. Before you say, no license is required, I'm good to go. You have to start thinking about whether or not it's a routed transaction, whether or not it's going to go somewhere else. So if I'm selling to Felicia and she's telling me, no, it's just going to me, or I'm not even asking. So that's a recent example we have. Client made a sale. I sold it to Felicia. She's good. She's in Puerto Rico. What do I have to worry about her? Not even an export. But Felicia, she sells it to Iran. She sells it to Russia. She sells it to somebody that's on our bad guy list. But what did I do wrong? I didn't ask her. I didn't say, Felicia, are you the end user? Are you using these for you and your company? What are you doing with these items? If I don't ask her, it's my fault for not asking, not her fault, mine. Now, she's in the US and she's also exporting these to bad guy countries. She may get in trouble too. So let's not get her completely off the hook there. But let's say she's out of the US, and I'm exporting it to her and I think all is well. And it's really not. So those are those general prohibitions that we have to think of. Normally, when you're looking at licensing, you're looking at your ECCN, you're looking at your general prohibitions, and then you're looking at your country chart. So you're saying for my particular item, if there's a rationale for national security that we should be careful for, and we're exporting to X country, and there's an X in the country chart, that means I need a license before I can export to that particular country unless a license exception takes place. And I'll say, if you're utilizing a license exception, I would get written confirmation that that license exception is really applicable to your particular business model. Quite often, you may think the license exception takes place and really is applicable, but what if it really isn't? You're doing it wrong. So I like written confirmation where I can get that. When you're thinking about hiring foreign nationals, I want you to think about a potential license. If it's a foreign national that's potentially dealing with some sexy software, you may need a license just to hire somebody. You may not think of these things. But this particular list I find is a very useful tool that I want everyone to include within your export compliance plans, because I want you to think of how you make the decision of how your particular item is classified. The majority of items are classified under the ECCN or under the EAR, for example, not necessarily under ITAR. But if you are under ITAR, same thing, same philosophy, same concepts, okay? So this is where you do your risk assessment to see what you're going to concentrate more on in your own export compliance plan. Another must. So I've used different forms, I've created different forms, and I've had our clients use this form. I don't care what you use, but in my example before where I'm selling to Felicia, but she's then selling to a bad guy, did I ever get a written statement from Felicia? Because here, it winds up being more of her problem than my problem when I say, Felicia, I need you to sign this form. This is my end user form. We call it the 711. So it's the BIS form 711. And I love this form because it's a fillable form. You Google BIS 711 form and it pops right up and it's a fillable PDF. So I asked Felicia to fill out the form and I get to have her say, all right, A, it's going to be used by me. I promise. Guess what? She swears. She swears. Because this whole little section here says, I swear it's all the truth and nothing but the truth, right? And then she is the official. She's the owner of her entity. She signs it and she's the purchaser. And I'm the exporter, for example, and everybody signs this form. And this is our understanding of what is happening with this transaction. Now, if Felicia's processing the items or incorporating the items into a following product to be manufactured in for distribution in, you're discussing all of this in the form. If she's going to be resold by her. So what if Felicia tells me, yeah, I'm reselling it to Russia, no biggie. Am I going to say, wait a minute, that's a red flag right now? I better, right? And here, this is where it's on Felicia to tell me the truth, and it's on me to make sure that I at least ask. My obligation is I can't just sell to Tom, Shariah, Heidi, Felicia. I can't sell to anyone without asking first, are you the end user? Or is this going to be like me selling to Walmart where it could be any end user? So that's where it gets a little fun and complicated. We get a lot of, but what do you want me to do? You want me to follow everybody around? You want me to get on a plane and go monitor Felicia and put a GPS tracker on her? No. I'm not asking for GPS trackers on every single thing you sell. Nobody's being unrealistic, but we are also not asking for you to hide your head in the sand. So where's an easy mix between the two? This form per order, but it's so annoying. It's so cumbersome. Okay, well, should I go back to the penalty chart or should we stay here? What's easier for you? At the end of the day, how are you proving that you utilized due diligence in this transaction? How are you proving that you checked to make sure Felicia wasn't on the bad guy list and anyone she told you she was going to resell the item to isn't on the bad guy list? If she tells me I'm going to sell to somebody in Russia, am I checking the consolidated screening list? I better be. So that's our bad guy list. Now, when I send my commercial invoice to Felicia because I want to get paid, on my commercial invoice, I'm going to use what's called the destination control statement. This is in the regs, and I love it, and you need to love it. Embrace it. And if you're not currently using it on all of your commercial invoices right now, that's something that's going to change today, right away. And this is pro tip. Every commercial invoice that you have that you issue must state this. And it says, I'm selling these items to you, Felicia. These items are controlled by the US government, and you're promising they're going to go to you or the end user that you tell me. You can't resell, you can't transfer, you can't send them to any bad guy without first obtaining approval from the US government. And because I'm selling to you, you better make sure that you don't screw up. It's a great way to also cover your butt for a second time here. So you're checking your own supply chain, you're checking your own license requirements, and then you're also putting an onus on your customer to fill out a form and to tell you who the end user is. And you're also giving the end user a caveat saying, all right, you told me you're the end user, that better be true. And if it's not, you better do the right thing. It's a nice thing to have that the government's going to look for. All right. So I like this mini checklist, and I like summarizing some of these things because it winds up getting a little complicated sometimes. So where do we start? We start with, what's my product? What is it that I'm selling? Am I selling notepads? Am I selling food? Am I selling nail files? Am I selling coasters? Am I selling water? Whatever it is I'm selling, whatever the item is. How do I classify that product? Are they EAR 99 or is there an ECCN? Who regulates me? Am I dealing with BIS? Am I dealing with Bureau of Industry and Security? Am I dealing with state? Am I dealing with DDTC? What am I dealing with? What agencies do I need to deal with? Who do I need to comply with? Do I need a license? Do I not need a license for this particular transaction? I have to go through my decision mind map. And I have to evaluate my end users and end uses. Did I check my bad guy list? Now, one of the questions we just got is, well, when do I need to do the 7-Eleven? When should I be doing this? Well, here's my question to you. If the government comes a knocking and says, so you sold product to Felicia, who was later found to be selling products to Russia, did you ask her who the end user was? And you say, no. Or if you say, yes, of course I asked her, and she filled out this form and she lied to me, what situation do you think you are better off with the federal government? So in my instance, if you are exporting goods, period, you're subject to US law. So what's the harm in having your customer fill this out? Besides it being a pain, besides you not wanting to, besides it being something else for you to do. It's a great tool for you to have in your toolkit to what I call CYA. And my job is to protect my clients' tushies as much as possible. So I think it's a great tool for you to utilize. Does everybody want to utilize it always? So another great question that was just asked was using the destination control statement in your invoice as opposed to your contract of sale. How about both? If you have a contract, I mean, unfortunately, and I don't know how many of you are small businesses, but how many of you have contracts in place and how many of you don't? What I see quite a lot of are purchase orders and commercial invoices and no actual contract. If you do have a contract in place, I love you adding that as a clause to your contract and a condition for your purchasers. And then I've done that recently where we put it in our contract and we additionally put it on our invoice. My point is it shouldn't be one or the other. If you additionally have a contract, put it in there too. Put it in both. Another good one is OFAC watching Russia payments. What do you think? Of course they are. Felicia can answer that one too. Does OFAC care about Russia? Are they monitoring money to and from Russia right now? Alicia says yes, 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 yes. Definite yes. All right, red flag checklist. So another BIS checklist that they have that they utilize often is the red flag checklist. So be aware, it's one of my cheat sheets for you at the end, so you'll utilize this as a resource. I like this to be included within your export compliance manual as well, to look through and to look for red flags, which is somebody paying you cash, is a bakery asking for night goggles, you know, or weird things happening that just don't make sense. Is anything a little fishy? And if it is, what do you do as a company? So I want that within your export compliance plan. Auditing. So one of my favorite things to do, right? So I love ACE. And if you don't love ACE, I highly recommend it. If you don't know what ACE is, let me fill you in. Let me give you the scoop. The automated commercial environment. When your broker or forwarder are filing your 7501 for your imports or your 7512 and your EEIs, for example, everything's electronic now. It's all online. So cool. And here's the sexiest part. You can ask for your data electronically. You don't have to stand there and wait 5 years, pay $250, get a CD 10 weeks later. Like, the process of it being super cumbersome to get your data doesn't exist anymore. So in my opinion, it's insane and inexcusable to not have access to your data because it's your data. Why shouldn't you have your own data at any given point in time? So if you learn nothing else today, request your own ACE account. If you need help with that, I am happy to set you up. What we do is we set up our clients and then we give them a report card. We basically grade you. So what we do is we get you set up and we look at your imports and exports and we say, great, here are the transactions I want you to monitor. Here's things that look fishy here. So what do we look at? Your ITN. If you're filing EEIs, as you should be for over $2,500 worth of valued goods, you better have an ITN. If you have a transaction without an ITN, that would be really, really, really bad. Is there a routed transaction indicator? Maybe those are ones we wanted to monitor more closely. If you have an ECCN in there and maybe you don't have a license, maybe we want to validate whether or not you really have a grounds for not having a license. When did you export? And then we compare, well, when did you file your EEI? Was it timely? Was it late? We have a last updated date and a late filer indicator. We love to look at those. So maybe we flag all the late files and we say, wait a minute, who's filing? Where did I have a mess up? Who didn't give what information to whom fast enough? What was the issue here? Who's the USPPI? Is it the correct entity? What's the foreign port of unlading? Support of export as well is another biggie that we look through. What's the country of ultimate destination? So for example, it's really going to Russia. Are you saying that? Are you saying another country? That wouldn't be good. Is that incorrect? What's the description of the commodity? What's your Schedule B? What's the value of your particular goods? Sometimes we pick the highest value and the lowest value and a value in between. Sometimes we pick specific countries to target. Sometimes we look at late files. Sometimes we look at ECCNs. You can look at a combo of these things. So you can pick your magic sauce of your highest risk for your particular company. So what I like to see is you having your own internal audit. How often should you do this is one of the number one questions. Well, some people do it weekly. Some people do it monthly. Some people do it every 6 months. Some people do it every 12 months. I ask you, how many transactions do you have a month, a year? If you have one transaction a year, once a year could be great because you only had one transaction. If you have thousands of transactions a year, doing that once or twice a year, that's going to stink. That's going to be a brutal few days for you to get through all this data. So if you have mountains of data, then I'd really suggest you on a weekly basis checking for errors and looking at some high risk categories, coming up with your own internal best practices and reporting. So now, what happens if you're utilizing bad data and there were mistakes? We saw a lot of this over COVID, especially. How many of you have remote workers? I think we all can say we do in some elements, right? That's not going away. How much harder is it to go through training remotely? I mean, with the advent of Zoom, it's not, but maybe it is. Maybe there's less oversight. Do your employees call for help when they need it when they're filing? Maybe they don't as much. It's not as easy as somebody looking over your shoulder sitting next to you. So we saw a lot of errors where EEI filings were late or they didn't happen at all and there was no ITN or there were wrong ports, or we've even seen some where, oh, I'm exporting, but the foreign port of unlading is the US. What? It's an export, but you're telling me it's going to the US and it's from the US. Do you realize that sounds a little strange? And it stinks, but you could say that in the EEI filings. Why does that make any sort of sense? I don't know. But do people screw up and put that all the time? I'm exporting from the US to the US. Everybody should laugh at that. It's a joke. It's not possible. But can you do it? Yeah. Is it a mistake? Absolutely. Did you fix it? Yeah, you need to fix it. So should that fixing it happen simultaneously with, for example, a disclosure to census? A lot of it did for us. So when it comes to ACE, I again urge you to consider ACE as a really, really, really amazing tool and select roughly 10 to 20% of your transactions. Come up with a risk-based ratio that makes sense for you. If you're not on ACE, please, I beg you, get on it. Record keeping, 5 years minimum, please, I beg of you. Now, when it comes to record keeping, it's important. And yes, you can use the cloud. Yes, you can be electronic. I have zero issue with that. Another thing I highly recommend that not enough people listen to me to is if your forwarder is filing the EEI on your behalf, get a copy, ask for it, maintain it, you keep it. Do you actually validate the EEI filing data that went out via your forwarder? Are you looking for it? Are you asking for it? Ask them to send that with their commercial, with their invoice to you. They want to get paid for the transaction. Fabulous. Well, I would like a copy of your EEI filing, please. Just a screenshot. Thank you. If the government comes a knocking. So these can be scary times, and it happens to the best of us. There can be planned visits. There's a lot of times I'm the government and I'm here to help. Okay, maybe true. I want to do an informed compliance visit and I want to teach you some stuff because I'm not so sure you know what you're doing yet. Okay, thanks. I appreciate the help. Or guns ablazing, I have a search warrant. Everybody stop and give me your computers. Okay, well, that's a different scenario. And both happen routinely. And if the government's coming and taking over cell phones and computers and hard drives and getting all your data, that's not a friendly visit. So what are some things we want to think about and do? So what are some best practices? Well, I want to get everybody out. That's an early dismissal day, everybody. And you don't want everyone necessarily talking to the government either. So you want to caution people to go home. Enjoy your day off, buddy. You want to have somebody taking detailed notes of anything the government's asking for. Government wants a copy, great, make a copy for yourself as well. Record anything that they're saying and asking for. You have the ability to do that. If it's a planned visit, same scenario. You want to keep the government in a specific location. You do not let them free roam your facility in any way, shape, or form without escorts. I think about CTPAT procedures. So when they come in, you want them to sign a visitor log. You want to get business cards. You want to know who's physically coming. You want to know who you're talking to. You want their contact information, just like they want to know who you are. You want to know who they are. And you want to have their info. You want to know exactly what they're talking about, anything they want copies of, you want to see too. And your lawyers are your friend. Contact them, especially if search warrants are flying. You need lawyers. That's the stage where lawyers. It's a 911 call. Now, when all goes wrong, don't panic. Don't have a heart attack. You're no use to anybody in the hospital. You have to be breathing, but you do have to stop the transaction. You have to retain your records. And at this day and age, you have to report. I'm going to skip a slide for a second to show you why you have to report, because this is another consideration. In April this year, not so long ago, there was a memo that came out, and it's from Mr. Axelrod, Assistant Secretary for Export Enforcement. But I want to show you the most important part of this memo. In summary, companies should carefully weigh a decision not to disclose any violation as you know it. Because if you commit a violation of the EAR and you make a disclosure, you can benefit greatly by getting a very reduced penalty. But if you make a deliberate decision not to disclose, you are then treated as an aggravating factor and you risk an increased penalty because you did not proactively communicate with the government and disclose when you should have. So we've got 3 Bloomberg articles that I highly encourage you also, including within your export compliance plan. Census, everybody has to deal with. If you're exporting, you better be filing your EEI if you're over $2,500 for your Schedule B. And I pray that your exports are over $2,500. Everybody has a whole lot of value of exports getting out. And if you mess up your EEI filings, you have to think about when it's time to call census and when it's time to disclose. Same thing with OFAC and with BIS. We have another one for DDTC as well. So your voluntary disclosures to all of these agencies is something you should be considering. So for each one of these articles, it has the how-tos and what should be included within. So I want you to think about these and think about including them. We have a top 10 tips for you as your cheat sheet that kind of summarizes everything we talked about today. And the best part is it has hyperlinks. So for example, for your end user, it has a link to the 7-Eleven. The consolidated screening list takes you to the consolidated screening list. The red flag checklist takes you to the red flags that I was talking about. So goes through all of the steps. So at the beginning, who regulates me? What's my product? Don't I need a license? What should I be asking my Felicia, my customer? How do I export, making sure I'm using the right ECCN, my license? Do I need one, not need one? Is my AES filing, that's my EEI export electronic information, done correctly when needed? Who's filing it? And then, do I have my written compliance program? How am I performing my meaningful risk analysis? How am I ensuring that my senior officials are on board? How am I training my employees thereafter? And if all goes wrong and I have to report a violation, what am I doing? If my goods are seized, what am I doing about it? How am I auditing myself internally? What am I doing differently? So the big thing is, if you do mess up, how do you have remedial activity? What are you doing to correct internally what you've messed up? So we've seen that happen quite a bit, especially during our times of COVID, where there were mistakes in employee filings. Great. What part didn't make sense? Well, we mistakenly said we were exporting to the US. Well, that's not even a possibility. So how did we do that? Who didn't validate that? Well, usually we do weekly audits, but we stopped. Okay, well, we're going to start that again. Those are, how do we catch mistakes when we make them as well? And voluntary disclosures are important to do. And now you can see from Biz, they're taking them extra seriously when you don't do them. So if you notice and you don't tattletale on yourself when you do notice a big mess up, the government will use that against you if they notice before you have the opportunity to tell. Record keeping, and I never ever pay without a fight. We've got a whole lot of tools for you. I also have another export compliance builder. So we've got a whole lot of articles. So one is, if you're building and maintaining an export compliance plan, just like someone was kind enough to put in a Q&A box, we have a tool here from Bloomberg Law as well, where we wrote an article about what should be in your export compliance plan. It's a great summary that we're going to give to all of you as well for what to include. Export licensing, it's another great article for you to look at. That's a great toolkit of how you deal with export licensing, and just an intro to export controls, as well as all of these are the disclosures that I urge you to include within as well. So if you're going to have to submit a disclosure, I urge you to at least put these requirements in there, so you at least know, if I have to submit a disclosure to any of these agencies in the future, I'm going to use these as a resource to make sure that I do it right. The last things I will say is, keeping up is brutal. And I've seen a couple of questions that we won't be able to get to now about how to keep up. And what are the changing regulations going on? And do I need a license for this? And I'm exporting this to Russia. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it ugly? Is it under a general license? Is it okay? Not okay? We are consistently updating our trade community either via our newsletter or via our weekly blogs. So we do weekly blogs on snapshots on what's going on in the industry and what's going on with Russia, who's added to the bad guy list, who's deleted, what the latest and greatest is. So I urge you to keep in touch with us either on our blog or a monthly newsletter. This is our adorable head of security, Lucky, who's got his little paws dirty. And we've got all sorts of ways to contact us and keep in touch. If any of you are on LinkedIn, I urge you to connect. I'm active on LinkedIn. We've got our link tree of all of our newsletters, our webinars, and Insta, and LinkedIn, and Facebook, and Twitter, and every social media platform you can imagine we're utilizing. And we put our snapshots on there as well. So urge you to keep in touch with us there as well. And all of us have our email addresses here, and I know I like to keep things timely, and I always talk over. So thank you, Tom and Heidi, for not yelling at me yet. And I urge you all to keep in touch with us and tell us and give us feedback. Let us know what you liked, what you want to hear more of, because there's so much to get in depth on. For any of the topics we brushed on today, Tom, I think we can do about 30 more sessions. There's an interest on so many of these fun topics, but I hope everybody at least learned one new thing today, because that's how I approach life. If I learned one new thing, it wasn't a waste of my hours. So I hope everybody here feels the same way.
Very good, Jennifer. Thank you so much. This was very informative, and obviously you are an expert when it comes to trade law. So we do appreciate all of those who attended the webinar today. Thank you very much for your time. And Felicia, thank you. Shariah and Heidi, thank you very much as well. And again, Jennifer, thanks so much for this very, very well done presentation, and we look forward to having you back and presenting another webinar related to export compliance. Thank you again to everybody. Enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thanks so much. Have a great one, everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Great, thanks.